every single object that has that material and change the color of it. It's an abstraction away from the individual pieces. Okay, so we can change the colors here, or we can add what's called a texture. We can say this is our image that I want to put on all these objects. Here is my image. So let me go find an image that I downloaded earlier. Here's my wall. You have JPEGs or PNGs, you can drag them right into your asset spot, and it loads it up inside your Unity as an asset, something that you could use as a texture. So, walls are now the texture for this material, and my objects now, see their nice shade of purple there. Let's change that up back to white. Much better. You get a preview down here of what your material looks like applied to the standard objects. Spheres, cubes, cylinders, torus. This is what your material will look like when you're put on some object. And if you have some other types of meshes that you drag in, you can test them out, but this is what it's going to do to that. So let's see some other options here. Now that we have this picture, we can tile it. This picture is conveniently set up so that the edges are conveniently wrapping. Other types of pictures will have wrapping where you say, okay, here's half a circle, the other half of the circle's over there. You should find images that can be tiled, that can easily be placed, and you can merge them together along their edges very conveniently. So I can change this to say, what should my tiling be? On this surface then, 2 by 2 says there's 2 this way and 2 that way, as much as you want. Okay, you could do 1 by 2, 1 tile this way, 2 tiles that way, stretch them out, make them fit however you want them to be tiled. And then there's the offset part. Let's look at that. Offset is a number between 0 and 1 that says, how much do I shift it? Normally the texture says, start here, and my tile consists of the whole thing. But the offset, say it can be 0.5, notice now we have 1 tile, but it started in the middle and ended in the middle over here. It still has the top and the bottom the same, but it rotated it. 0.5, let's just make that easier to see. 0, 0.1, it's shifting it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. So if you want to rotate your tiling, start it in different places, your offset can do that. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the texture part of a material. Materials have textures, they have colors, they also have shaders. The shader right now is called a diffuse shader. And if you select that, there's lots of different options you can see. There's only a couple that I'll talk about. You can explore the other ones. But default for all of your objects is diffuse. What does that mean? It essentially looks like a fuzzy object. I found a great website about diffuse. And you're used to, in physics, thinking that light reflects off a surface at an exact perfect angle. Whatever angle it comes in, it bounces off. This is what you might expect to happen in physics. With your light, comes back exactly like that. But most objects are bumpy. Most objects are rough. And so it's going to be what's called a diffuse surface. The opposite, what you might be used to just from thinking about physics and theoretical stuff, is called specular. And you can choose in this Unity game engine, should it be specular or diffuse? Those are the two options. Those are the words. So diffuse says it's a rather fuzzy, rough object. Or we could pick specular to say this is a shiny object. This is very smooth, and whatever happens with the light, it should be reflecting off much more like it's a shiny metal surface. This is the specular. Let's go back to diffuse. Less shiny. The light is bouncing off in many different ways. Specular, it bounces off in those perfect theoretical physics directions. So, materials have a texture that we can pick, and they have a shader. Material says, how is this going to look? And the shader says, what is it going to look like? One place I read had a great example of a shader being, is this object wet or not? The wetness, if you put water drops on it or get it wet on a table, it's going to look a little different, but you didn't change the actual texture of the object. You didn't change the colors underneath or the pattern, unless you get it wet for a long time and it's a book cover or something like that. But you want to just think of the texture being the picture and the shader being an interpretation, something in between the texture and your eyes that tells you how it's going to look. Does that make sense? So materials have textures and shaders. So you can pick also the specular color. Once it's specular, you can say, what is the shiny color? And I could make it red here, so that light is bouncing off as a red light, or a green light, or however you want it to be. This object has this kind of light reflection property. Let's go back to gray. Okay, any questions about these textures and shaders and how they fit together? Yes?
So I tried to put a texture on a plane, but it was oriented wrong. So the texture had a specific orientation to make it look right.
Okay.
So is there a way to change the orientation, like rotate the texture, or you just have to rotate the whole thing?
I think you might have to rotate the plane,
Okay.
or rotate the image before you load it in. I don't know how, it doesn't seem to have a rotation option here. It has the how many times you want to tile it, how much you want to shift it, but not, I want this texture to be rotated. I think it's probably because that might look different on spheres or cylinders or other objects. You're trying to define it in general, what's going to happen with this texture, and then the mesh underneath really determines how that rotation works. Cool. Other questions? Okay, here's the next thing we want to see with these shaders. They could be specular or diffuse, or they could be bumped diffuse and bumped specular. This introduces to our objects a new dimension, essentially. Let's make this bumped diffuse. We have more options now. We have our texture. We picked a bumped diffuse shader, and it says you need a normal map. What do you think that means?
Where on the texture it's going to be lighter and darker. Now, this is more rough over here, this is more smooth over here.
That would be part of it. That could be another, I think that's a slightly different type of shader. This one is talking about the surface itself. How is the surface bumped or smooth? So the word normal doesn't mean give me a nice regular map. It means normal in the terms of vectors. And so if you say this is my surface, the normal is the perpendicular of that surface. How should the light reflect? It's depending on the normal, depending on the plane of where that surface is. So what you can do with these shaders is say, here's my object, here's my picture. It looks rather flat. Instead of saying, I want a cube that has a bunch of bumps in it, let's go make a really complicated mesh that has tons of triangles and tons of surfaces and tons of ways to reflect it. Instead of making a super complicated surface and a mesh, a shader lets you take a very flat mesh with just a couple edges and define on it how does the light reflect as if it was a super complicated mesh. This is the normal part. So I put in this texture to say it looks like it has a bunch of stone blocks on it. And now I'm going to define it and say, really, these darker spots are crevices, and these lighter spots are the tops. So luckily, I have downloaded as well a normal map for this picture. Let's make that bigger. So these are my tiles, and this is what's known as the normal map. There's an intermediate stage between them. You generally give Unity a grayscale image to talk about the dimensions of where it is, and it generates from that the normal map. So you'd be able to say, here in my image, let's say I have a hole, and this here is trying to talk about a surface. Let's see if I can draw a surface here. Does that make sense? This is my three-dimensional picture of what this looks like two-dimensionally. There's really a hole in here. I want that to be what happens when I move the lights around, when I move this object. So to do that, I would create a two-dimensional grayscale image that tells me the depths of this texture. Where is it deeper? Where is it lighter? And from that, it generates the normal map. So this normal map usually has a really particular color. It's usually blue with a couple reds and greens to it. Why do you think that is? What is the normal map trying to record?
Light bounces.
The bouncing, the actual reflections, the planes for each of these points. What is that plane of what should be happening? So to do it, it didn't create a whole new file format. It said we're just going to use JPEGs or PNGs and whatever, and those always have these RGB channels, red, green, and blue. You can always go to an image really quickly in a graphics card or whatever and get out the red element, the green element, and the blue element and show that to the screen. That happens really, really fast with the graphics cards we have today. So a lot of places with shaders to make these fake bumpy images take something like this and say, I can easily access the red, green, blue channels, but I'm not going to use them as red, green, and blue. I'm going to use them as the dimensions x, y, and z, and know that this turns into a vector for me, a normal vector. So a very common color that you see would be blue, which means here I'm going to reflect exactly out of the object. If my perpendicular to this is exactly what you would expect, then my color XYZ should be 0, 0, 1, which gives me an RGB color